Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Evolution of Satan, the first session, an introduction. Whether you're watching live with me tonight or whether you are joining in later tomorrow or some other later point, I want to thank you for taking that time. I'm absolutely passionate about the scriptures and understanding things of God. And so this is a little discussion that's been a very, very long time coming. And I'm thankful that I have the opportunity to share that with some people. So if you're new to the group or new to some of these studies, this is about the fifth one we've done. It's nice to meet you. My name is Frans. We're going to be running for about 6 weeks, and we'll do our best to fit that into that time period. And that will be about 45-minute sessions on a Wednesday night. And I'm hoping that this will be informative. I'm hoping that it would at least bring to light some things that maybe you were not aware of. And I think that's where the real value lies. As I will be discussing a little bit later, it's not my mission here to bring you doctrine or dogma. It is really my mission to explore what we already know, what is actually widely known in the academic and the scholarly world of the scriptures. And it's just stuff that growing up in church, people don't share with us. Pastors don't preach about it. It's not really very good preaching material. And so it's really just my mission to bring that stuff out to you tonight. So if you're joining us now, welcome. It's so nice. I'm out here at my house, at my pool, and it's lovely and cool out here tonight. If the wind does come up and it affects the sound quality, please just let me know, and I can very, very quickly move inside and we can continue from there. All right, now before we get going with this introductory session, I just want to give a rather pedestrian interpretation of the poll I sent out in the group. And there were a couple of questions about what do you think about the devil or Satan, and it to me was pretty interesting when I went back to the poll and I had a look at some of the answers. I found it quite fascinating because it actually tells me something. Now, I don't know who said what, I didn't go there and say, Kwissy said that or whatever. But here are some interesting facts as a small little introduction to the introduction. Number one, I'm so relieved that we have no Rebecca Brown fans here. I was highly influenced by Rebecca Brown as a young teenage boy, and I'm so thankful none of you are the same as me. I note that nobody is hardcore enough to say Satan is a toothless fairy, which I guess is a good thing in some degree. But something that really, really struck me, and you might want to just think about this a little bit, is that 62%, like almost 2/3 of everyone, chose options. These options were actually, I don't think of him at all, or he's inconsequential to my life, which to me tells me a story. Like, it tells me that, if you had to find out tomorrow morning that Satan doesn't exist, or you get a secret email from Jesus saying, I killed him last night, it's not going to change your life. You are almost already living as if he has no effect on your life, which I guess is a great thing. But I like to call that or to note that there is, and that's always been my observation, that a lot of Christianity already lives like Satan doesn't actually exist. Like we might theoretically believe in him, or dogmatically or doctrinally, but we don't live as if he's around every corner. And so it was quite telling for me that 65% of you guys, you chose those options, the ones that said that he's inconsequential, or you just don't think of him at all. That was interesting to me. But the most fascinating pedestrian interpretation of this poll was that nobody actually chose the one which I would call undisputed fact about the idea, the concept, or the person, or the identity of Satan in the Hebrew scriptures and also the New Testament scriptures, and that is that he is an enemy. And nobody chose that. I find it absolutely fascinating. I don't know why. Maybe we'll find out as we go along. So, if you're joining, welcome. The idea of Satan from the Hebrew, Satan, and as we know today, devil from the Greek, diabolos, is firmly rooted in the consciousness of our Christian thought. So much so that, I don't know about you, but we just don't make time to think about questions of its origin. Where does it actually come from? Who mentioned it first? You know, in the scriptures, if we're running through the scriptures in a more or less chronological way, who mentioned Satan first? People generally don't know that. Because it's one of those things we're born into. We accept it, that it is, and it is in this way, and we all have maybe some varying degrees of what we see and how we see it. But it's kind of like it's just accepted and we just go with it, and by the time you are 7, you're told, don't be careful of this, the devil does this and that and that. And you kind of just grow up in this idea of what the devil is. But there's very few of us that actually takes time to go back and say, okay, let me start again from the scriptures. Where does this actually come from? And I'm hoping that this little study will be able to do that for us. At least throw out some information as we journey through the Hebrew scriptures predominantly on where this idea come from, what it is, what does it look like, how did it influence them, how should it influence us. Who mentioned it first? Is it just a character? There's a lot of Christians that believe that Satan is just a concept. There are many Christians that believe that it's an actual being. I'm not really here to answer that question. I'm just here to throw some ideas and what I consider to be historical ideas and influences on this concept, and also then obviously basing most of it within the Hebrew scriptures, which I value so much. I consider it inspired. But I've also learned to read it in slightly different way. So, just a couple of concepts today as I introduce this to you, as one or two concepts that's going to be very valuable to us as we journey into this study. And I'm going to make sure that I don't go over my time here tonight. I want to be 45 minutes and then take up an offering. No, just kidding. So, have you ever thought of the fact that by the time we get to the New Testament, when you're reading the New Testament, I'm assuming that many of you have read large portions of the New Testament repeatedly. When you get to the New Testament, it takes the time, no writer of the Gospels or even Paul that much, nobody explains where the devil comes from. Nobody explains what it is. It's just there, and it's kind of just operating, and it's just part of New Testament understanding. And that was one of the trigger questions for me. Like, why don't they explain? Why don't the writers of the New Testament actually explain to us where the devil comes from? They don't. We've got to draw our own conclusions. And, we pull a scripture here, we pull a scripture there, and we kind of put something together so we kind of feel we know how it would have happened. But, it would have been really helpful if Matthew, just before he, for instance, mentions the temptation of Jesus by Satan, if he had just explained to us quickly what Satan actually is and where he comes from and what his purpose is. And we don't get that. No writer of the New Testament really takes time to do that for us. And I think the reason is because there is an already accepted, generalized, or cultural norm of what the devil is and what it does. In other words, the point is simply that the New Testament does not create its own devil. It's inherited a devil or a Satan from the time that went before it. So basically, if you can say it this way, this is the theological waters that the New Testament already swims in. The writers did not create it. And in the study, this is our purpose here. Our mission is to investigate, where do the first century Jews, where did they get their idea of Satan from, and what did it look like? How did it come about? And what did it actually look like for them? And then also, obviously, leading up to their time. So here I want to just introduce something very, very simple. It's an idea, but it really is an idea that has changed my life quite dramatically. And so I have very limited time, but I just want to throw it out there because I think this will help as we move forward. Theological ideas do not drop out of the sky at a moment. They actually develop. Theology means the logic about God. And when someone does theology, he's trying to put into logical understanding the data points he has about God, which is predominantly from the scriptures. And from that is built a theology or an understanding or a logic about what God actually is. But contrary to general assumption, theological ideas actually develop over time. They evolve, and they evolve under pressure. Pressures of the actual consciousness of the people that are writing, political influences, cultural and religious syncretisms. So that doctrine does not just appear, it evolves, it develops into what many of us today have very strong doctrines that we hold to. You can think about the doctrine of the Trinity as an example, something many people hold to as a irrefutable fact of theology. But even the Trinity, as we'll see in a moment, the Trinity is something that developed. It wasn't it wasn't just present in the scripture from the beginning. Most definitely very, very absent in the Hebrew scriptures. And then it seems like in the New Testament scriptures, it becomes a more possible proposition. But it's really only, the word Trinity, which comes from the Latin, only really appears towards the end of the 2nd century AD. The word only appears, and in that time, that word does not even hold the theological meaning that Trinity would mean for someone like me and you today. And it's really only in the 4th century where Trinitarian view of God became the standard and everything else was rejected. The point is simply that theologies, they develop over time. And I think if you can get your head around that, it's going to be easier to accept the process we're going to be taking here today. Now, I like to explain this by a very sophisticated theological metaphor called the muffin, right? If you've ever had a great muffin at one of your favorite coffee shops, you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, the thing about a muffin is just this, that the muffin did not always exist. There was actually a time when the muffin didn't exist. There was a time where the muffin didn't exist, but what did exist a time long ago was wheat. You know, if you build, I'm not a great baker, but I know that you need wheat flour to make a muffin. I know that you need milk and you need sugar and maybe a couple of other things. But the reality of the existence of the muffin is just simply that there was a time when it was only wheat. There was a time when it was sugar. There was a time where there was a cow who brought milk. And a muffin is really the coming together of many streams of long processes and developments within each of those processes to bring you what the beautiful smelling thing that you order at one of your favorite coffee shops, the muffin. So there was a time when the muffin didn't exist, a time where there was only wheat in the field, sugarcane on the hills of KZN, and some free roaming cars somewhere in the Midlands. And you cannot call the wheat muffin, and you cannot call the sugarcane muffin, and you cannot call the cow and its milk muffin. It was wheat, sugar, and milk. But eventually, these three units, these three types of commodities came together. They themselves went through processes and came together to make something called a muffin. Now, theology works very much the same way. Today, many of you, me and you, we sit with muffins, doctrines that look like a muffin. They smell great, and we just innocently assume that they've always been there. But the reality is that many of the doctrines we hold today is really the conflation, the coming together of many separate streams of theologies that get combined and pushed into and eventually forms this beautiful thing called a muffin. And now we kind of assume it's always been like this. And I think this is where we get to the idea of Satan that me and you have today is very much like the muffin. We assume that it was the idea from the beginning. We assume Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Daniel, Job, we assume that all of them had the idea of Satan we have today. We assuming that they all had they had muffins. But it is very, very possible. I would argue for this. This is the one thing I will argue for in these six sessions, is that it's possible that Job only had wheat, and that David had sugar, and that Moses had a cow, and that eventually by the time of Daniel we had wheat combined with sugar, and it looked something like not really a muffin yet, but it's on its way. And maybe I could postulate that it's only really in the Second Temple period where all the ingredients come together. It gets baked into something they then put on a plate for someone like Matthew. And Matthew's eating that muffin. He's loving the muffin. But the muffin was not there in Abraham's time. It wasn't there in Moses' time. So I'm trying to use an example that can illustrate how theology moves different processes and comes together into what we might have today, and that we might erroneously assume, and I think I've done this for most of my life, but I've stopped doing it now, that everyone had the same muffin down the timeline back, into the time of Abraham or Moses or whatever it might be. So to assume that the idea of Satan for Abraham, Moses, the first century BCE Jews, was all the same and the same as what we have today will actually be a huge mistake. We make this mistake all the time. We assume they had the same interpretations of Scripture that we hold today, when in fact, even in the Scripture itself, within our Bible, the library of Scripture, we today find evidence of the development of concept and ideas, especially then of course, theology. Consider the development of critical ideas like love and mercy from the time of Moses into the time of Jesus. We might be using the same four-letter English word, because we're English and it needed to be translated into our language. But in reality, those words carry different meaning because they come from a different context altogether. So the idea of Satan really is no exception to this phenomena of the development of theology. And this is our mission here. We want to follow their trail. We want to follow the breadcrumbs left for us. The breadcrumbs that were dropped along the way, so we can find our way back into the home. Right, so the development of the idea of Satan can be traced throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. And we're going to be turning our attention in this study to the Hebrew Scriptures. We're not going to be dealing with the New Testament. We will only be dealing with the Hebrew Scriptures. To study exactly this, the development of this idea. Where did it start? What is the next place? And we're going to be walking through every single Scripture that mentions the word Satan. There's not that many. So it won't take us the whole here. But there is a couple, and we want to walk through every one of them. The point I'm trying to make is we're going to be pretty thorough in building a picture from the Scriptures. We're going to take a look also then at the potential influences that could have weighed in on the train of thought of the Israelites that ultimately wrote the Scripture and then wrote of Satan in the ways that they did. And as we trace the development of Jewish religion into the Second Temple period, which is called Second Temple Judaism, we can also find Satan as a theological development within that journey. So the New Testament's idea and the New Testament's world, which includes the idea of Satan, is really a result of centuries of slow shifting. From even as far back as ancient pagan polytheistic ideas into the very strong monotheistic Jewish faith, which we're all very familiar with today. It's all part of our journey to spend time here on the concept of the devil or Satan from the New Testament, but we're only looking at how did we actually get here. So as long as that's clear, that'll take us a long way. As far as possible, my job here is, as I said very early on, is to refrain from dogmatic conclusions and quick answers. If you've joined tonight hoping to get a quick answer and a quick injection, it's not my style. It's just not going to happen. It's going to happen slowly. It's going to happen systematically. But I believe there's way more value in looking at the evidence for yourself over a slow, longer period of time than somebody telling you what you should believe. We want to take the journey, and I want you to come on the journey with me. And I want to present to you the evidence as far as I can see it, and to some degree what is accepted in the broader academic and scholarly world of the Scriptures, so that you can factor it into your understanding of the concept of Satan. So the pure Hebrew scriptural idea of what Satan is will actually be impossible to point out. And the reason for this is because it actually changes throughout Scripture. This might be a bit of a shock maybe to some of you, but this is what you find if you take the time to go and look. You don't find one single idea that pops up at every spot. You actually find a development of the idea. And so to say the biblical idea of Satan is A, B, C, and D is actually impossible, because you have to ask what writer and at what time, because the ideas differ and develop. So the fact that we sit with a fully baked muffin at this point does not mean that we started off with a fully baked muffin. So I want to introduce the concept here that's really going to help us on our bumpy journey ahead. This concept is also, I believe, very, very useful. I've given it my own terms, and there might be very fancy theological terms for what I'm going to be describing, but I've called it retrospective interpretation. And I believe that this is an absolute key in a better, more honest way of reading the Scriptures. Okay, so what is retrospective interpretation? Well, for me, retrospective interpretation means the following. It means when you reinterpret old text, Scripture, in the light of current events, current understandings, and possibly even cultural biases and ideas. And so you give new meaning to the old texts, right? Let me say this again. So retrospective interpretation, you've got to get your head around this one, means it is found when we reinterpret old Scripture, but we use today's facts, today's ideas, today's cultural norms to give those old Scriptures into a new interpretation and to kind of make them fit to what we have here today. The point being that the interpretation we give to those Scriptures might not be what the writer was actually meaning, because the writer, when he wrote, did not have our cultural biases, our cultural norms, our ideas, and our level of science, or whatever you want to call it. And so you kind of end up with where it was wheat, now it's a muffin. And I know the New Testament does this a lot, and I'm not saying it's wrong to do this, but I am saying when you do it, you need to acknowledge that you're doing it. And you can say that I think that means this for today, but you have to acknowledge also what it meant for back there. In other words, you can't go around saying the wheat is a muffin. It's not. But you can say that the muffin might contain some wheat, right? I want to explain this also just with a real-life example. Let's say, for instance, you had a dream about a monster attacking you one night in your bed. I had this a lot as a kid because the devil was haunting us, you know what I mean? Not actually haunting us, but all the stories about him was haunting us. So you had a dream about a monster attacking you in your bed one night. The next day you wake up, you're not sure what the dream means. It's possible that you might be very stressed. You might be in some conflict with your boss, or you might be in some conflict with your wife. Life is pushing at you. You might feel attacked, pushed into a corner by your circumstances, whatever it might be. And so you just leave it at that. But 2 months later, someone grabs your wallet at the supermarket and gets away with it. That night, it really hits you as you sit down and you're trying to make sense of the shock of what has happened to you. You realize and remember back, oh, you know what? I had that dream 2 months ago about this thing attacking me, and maybe this is the monster I dreamt of. And maybe it was, we do this, Christians are really good at this. It was a warning of some sort, but it still happened and your wallet is gone, right? And what we do then is from that point on, the wallet event, the event of contemporary time, we connect that back into the dream, so that from now on, this is basically one story. And when we sit down with our grandparents and our friends and our grandkids when we're old, and our friends, we tell the story as if it's one story. We assume that the dream about the monster was about about the attack that happened, the attack or the stealing of our wallet. And so we connect these two events together, where in fact, in reality, that dream had nothing to do with this event, but we retrospectively interpret the dream to make sense of current events. So maybe that's a way of kind of putting that into a real life example. The reality is we do this with the Scriptures all the time. And when you do this with the Scriptures, it's impossible to see when it's wheat and when it's muffin. If you're joining a little bit late, you need to go back and get the example of the muffin, right? So if we did apply this to the muffin, and this is the end of this little retrospective explaining session. It's like going back and looking at every kernel of wheat and insisting that it's actually a very small muffin, because you now know that you use wheat to make muffins. And then going back to the fields in the Free State where they grow the wheat and looking at the kernels of wheat and say, this is actually really, if you really think about it, this is actually a muffin. No, it's not a muffin. It's wheat. It can be used to make a muffin, but it is not a muffin. That is retrospectively interpreting the wheat for what you know it could be later on. It's the same of kind of insisting, you get the point. But the reason or the purpose that the wheat grows in the ground is not necessarily to make muffins. So this is the idea of retrospective interpretation. One of the best examples from the scripture itself, and I mentioned this very briefly earlier on, is the idea of doctrine, a very strong doctrine like the doctrine of the Trinity, right? To find the Trinity in the Hebrew scriptures explicitly it's basically an impossible task, although most of us assume that it's there. Even though, as I just said, even though Christians will point to, for example, the "let us make man" of Genesis 1:26, it's clearly as a case of retrospective interpretation that we assume that it is actually God speaking to the Trinity, where there's a much better contextual explanation for God in the beginning saying, "let us." Possibly this could be, and I can give you some examples, it could be God speaking to the angels, it could be polytheistic indicators within Israel, which is something we're going to be talking about. The point is the fact that we assume that that is a emergence or is a clear indication of the doctrine of the Trinity is a case of retrospective interpretation. So this might be a little bit tricky for some of you to take up, but the reality is the Trinitarian doctrine does not really find its footing in Christianity fully until the 4th century. So it develops. And so when you go back to Genesis 1:26, that's wheat. Trinitarian doctrine, what we have in the 4th century is a muffin. You cannot go back to the wheat and say it's a muffin. It's not. But the muffin is the result of the wheat slowly going through its processes of milling and cleaning and bleaching and whatnot, getting baked eventually. All right, that's enough. But I think this is very, very important. And the reason why this is so important is when we're going to start this journey in looking at the appearances of the idea of Satan from the scriptures. The first actual explicit appearance of this word is in the book of Numbers. And I know, and I've kind of just preempted, that the first question I'll be getting in the comments is possibly something like, well, if you're going to talk about the devil, why don't you start with the snake in the Garden of Eden? And this is why I try to explain the idea of the muffin and of retrospective interpretation, because the snake in the garden is not called Satan or the devil ever in the Old Testament and in the Hebrew scriptures. It's just not what it was. There are other explanations for what that could be. And so the point is just simply that the snake of Eden is not called Satan or implied to be Satan by the Hebrew scriptures. The idea only emerges after the theological developments, and especially those in Christianity. And it is a specific retrospective interpretation of the book of Genesis account from a future perspective, and not necessarily what the writer of Genesis meant. And the reason why we can be pretty certain about this is because we can now, after all the archaeological evidence that we have from the 20th century and late 19th century, we can place Genesis in its proper genre, and it's just not about the devil. But we will not spend our time reading the Hebrew scriptures from a Christian retrospective perspective. We're not going to be doing that. We're not going to be finding the muffin or going to look for the muffin in every piece of wheat, sugar cane, and cow and milk. We're not going to be doing that. We're going to treat wheat as wheat, sugarcane as sugarcane, and milk as milk. And we're going to treat them as they develop. So we will not spend our time doing that. But we're going to try to read the Hebrew scriptures from a pre-Christian perspective, if that makes any sense. But the point is that we want to read them from the context they were written and what they would have meant to those people. Those people were not Christians. They were not Trinitarians. And as you'll see, as we'll go through, the idea of Satan is not something that is explicitly stated, not in the way that we understand it from the very early Hebrew scriptures. The next question I'll be getting, and I'm preempting some of these things, is, okay, Franz, great, but what about Lucifer? And Lucifer is another example of this. We have a similar case here as the snake of Eden when we're dealing with the idea of Lucifer that pops up in, I think, Isaiah 14. These passages do not mention Satan. They do not mention the devil. So you have to interpret them in light of something else, and that's exactly what we Christians did. Many people interpret them to be about Satan. But that's not actually what the writers of Isaiah and Ezekiel, those two passages, meant, because they can so easily and very literally be understood as two passages about two tyrant kings, one from Tyre and one from Babylon, that became proudful, that became gods in their own minds, and eventually fell and died and lost their kingdoms and were taken over by others around them. So that's the reason why we're not going to be starting with the snake in Eden. And that's the reason why we're not going to be starting with passages like Lucifer. We're going to be dealing with the explicit mentions of the idea, or actually the word Satan, the Hebrew word, where it comes up and what it looks like in those contexts. So I'm hoping this is clear. This is a little bit technical. Forgive me. This is probably the most technical part of the whole series, but I don't think you can move on from here unless you try and get your head around this. Now, I want to take questions on this. Please pop them in the comments. If they're a little bit sensitive, throw them into the DMs, just message me directly. I'll keep it confidential. This is a safe space. We won't expose anyone, and so you'll be free to ask whatever questions. There are no questions that are above, that are, what's the right word? No questions that we won't take and won't take seriously. So please. We will investigate the chronological explicit mentions of the idea of Satan and try to eliminate the future generations' traditions and interpretations being read backwards, retrospectively, into the scriptures. That's what we're going to be avoiding like the plague. Now we turn our attention to the history of the kingdom of Israel and the development of the Yahwistic religion and how it impacted the idea of Satan. And so this is one thing that, and I'm getting to the end of this little session here, but to study the idea of Satan in the Hebrew scriptures, we also have to follow the development of the theological ideas within the religion of the Israelites. And once again, contrary to the assumptions I made most of my life, and I know Christians make all the time, you know, the Israelites, their way of approaching God and thinking about God also changed. And I'm going to show you this. This is actually quite obvious, but it's something we just never really think about. The point is just that it seems like the idea of Satan evolves with the evolution or the development of the religion of the Israelites. The history of the kingdom of Israel, we're going to break it up into three periods, and the three periods are going to be very simply the First Temple period. If you're not familiar with the history of Israel, King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, and a massive, beautiful thing, but it only lasted to about 586 BC. In 586 BC, the southern kingdom of Judah was exiled by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. He destroyed that temple, and it was a period of about 50 years more or less in which the Israelites didn't have a temple, didn't have a land. They couldn't practice their religion in the way that they were instructed to do so. So you have this first temple period, which is basically the period in which the first temple stands and is used for worship. Then we have the second period, which is the actual Babylonian exile, where there's no temple. And then we have that which is built again, of course, by Ezra, Nehemiah, those guys coming out of exile and building the second temple. And this is called the Second Temple period. This is the most interesting period for our discussion. And this is the third period that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to be dividing that third period into three further periods. The first one being the Persian period, the second one being the Hellenistic or the Greek period, and lastly, the early Roman period, which takes us into the New Testament and the life of Jesus. I'll say a little bit more about that next week, and we'll be dealing with these periods in detail. I will, if you have a look in the group, I've put a post up with the table of contents, And in there, you'll see the actual dates for all these periods. It's rough dates, and everything is rough when you're dealing with history. So it's more or less. But I think you'll see quite clearly that these three periods define for us three development areas and times in the religion of Israel, and then specifically with respect to our subject, the way that they view Satan within their times. We consider how the theological landscape of the Israelites changed throughout these periods, and how this influences their beliefs and their views on the concept of Satan. So, I'm done. Now that we understand the muffin and how the muffin works, we're going to get baking. So next week, we're going to do session 2, which is going to be called Solomon the Polytheist. And this is such an interesting concept, something that stares you straight in the face, but you don't know its name. And next week, I want to name it. And we're going to be looking at the internal scriptural evidence and the external archaeological evidence for the way in which the First Temple period approached God and their religion towards Yahweh. And that will have a huge impact on how they view the idea of Satan. Right, that's it for tonight. If you have questions, hit me up. I'll try my best. I don't know all the answers. I'll do my best. I really take time to answer questions from these sessions. You take the time to be here. I'll make the time to research answers, and I'll probably spend more time on researching the answer than what you take on typing your question. So I want to encourage that as far as you can. It's a safe space. We're going to expose to anyone. I'm going to ask everyone also to please don't use questions or answers that are given, comments and opinions of people within the group, and post it outside the group. It remains a safe space for everyone. We're all learning, we're all moving, and that's basically why it's a private group as well. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and I'll see you next week, Wednesday, same time, same place. Thanks so much. Cheers.